Welcome to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're talking about something that I know causes absolute dread in the dressage community. You've practiced your test 100 times at home. You know it forwards, backwards, and sideways. Your horse is going beautifully. You enter the ring, salute the judge, and then somewhere around the first transition or that tricky serpentine, your mind just goes completely blank. You have no idea what movement comes next. You're riding in front of the judge, the bell hasn't rung yet, and you've just completely forgotten your test. If you've experienced this, you know how frustrating and embarrassing it feels. And if you haven't experienced it yet, but you're terrified it will happen, that fear itself might actually be making it more likely to occur. Today, we're going to dig into the psychology and neuroscience of why memory fails under pressure, specifically in the context of dressage tests at shows. But more importantly, we're going to talk about what actually works to prevent it, based on what research tells us about memory, stress, anxiety, and performance under pressure. I'm calling this episode Why Your Brain Betrays You in the Show Ring, and we're going to spend the next hour really unpacking the mechanisms behind these memory lapses and the evidence based strategies that can protect your memory even when the pressure is highest. Let's start by understanding what's actually happening in your brain when you forget your test, because I think a lot of writers assume it means they didn't practice enough, or they're not smart enough, or there's something wrong with their memory in general. But the research on memory under pressure tells a very different story. These memory lapses aren't about general memory failure or inadequate preparation. They're about very specific psychological and neurological processes that happen when you're performing under stress and high stakes. The first thing to understand is the role of acute stress and anxiety in memory retrieval. When you enter the show ring, your nervous system registers that this is a high pressure situation. There are judges watching and evaluating you. There are consequences for mistakes. There's an audience. Your horse might be tense because they're picking up on the atmosphere or they're in an unfamiliar environment. All of these factors trigger what's called an acute stress response. Research shows that acute stress triggers the release of stress hormones, primarily cortisol and catecholamines like adrenaline. These hormones affect the brain regions that are critical for memory, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. The prefrontal cortex is involved in executive functions like planning, decision making, and retrieving information from memory. The hippocampus is crucial for forming and retrieving episodic memories, which includes the sequence of movements in your dressage test. What happens under acute stress is that these hormones temporarily impair the flexibility of memory retrieval. Your brain shifts from flexible, goal directed processing to more rigid, habitual processing. This shift can actually be helpful for automatic, well practiced physical skills. If you've practiced your sitting trot or your leg yields thousands of times, that motor memory is relatively protected under stress because it's become automatic and habitual. But the sequence of the test, the pattern of which movement comes when that's episodic memory that requires flexible retrieval, and that's exactly what gets disrupted by stress. The research shows that this impairment is particularly pronounced for retrieving information that's unrelated to the immediate threat or stressor. Your brain under stress is prioritizing threat related information and responses. The test sequence isn't threat related, even though failing to remember it feels threatening. So, your stressed brain isn't allocating sufficient resources to retrieving that sequence information. It's essentially deciding that remembering the test pattern is less important than monitoring for danger and preparing for fight or flight responses. Now, let's talk about anxiety specifically, because anxiety and stress aren't quite the same thing, and they affect memory through somewhat different mechanisms. Anxiety, especially high trait anxiety, which is someone's general tendency to experience anxiety, consistently impairs what's called working memory. Working memory is your brain's ability to hold information actively in mind and manipulate it. When you're riding through your test, you need working memory to track where you are in the sequence, to remember what comes next, and to adjust based on what's happening. Research shows that anxiety restricts working memory capacity primarily by occupying it with worry and intrusive thoughts. When you're anxious about forgetting your test, about making mistakes, about what the judge is thinking, about how your horse is going, all of those worried thoughts are consuming working memory resources. You're essentially running a dual task. You're trying to ride the test, and you're also running this internal narrative of worry and self doubt. That leaves fewer cognitive resources available for actually remembering and executing the test. There's interesting research showing that individuals with higher working memory capacity might actually be especially vulnerable to choking under pressure. You might think that having more working memory would protect you, but what happens is that people with high working memory rely on it more during performance. They use those cognitive resources to consciously control and optimize their performance. But when stress or anxiety consumes those resources with intrusive thoughts, suddenly those resources aren't available and performance suffers dramatically. People with lower working memory might already be relying more on automatic processes and less on conscious control, so they're less disrupted when working memory gets compromised. Let's talk about attentional processes, because attention plays a huge role in these memory failures. There are essentially two ways that pressure disrupts attention, and both can cause you to forget your test. The first is attentional distraction. This is when your attention gets pulled away from the task to internal worries or external distractions. You're supposed to be tracking where you are in your test sequence, but instead your attention is on thoughts like don't mess up, or the judge is watching, or my horse feels tense, or you're noticing someone's cell phone going off at ringside or a flag flapping in the wind. Research shows that people with high anxiety are particularly susceptible to attentional distraction. They have poorer attentional control, which means they're less able to keep their attention focused on task relevant information and more likely to get pulled toward threat related stimuli or internal worries. Every time your attention gets distracted from tracking your position in the test sequence, you're creating a gap in your memory retrieval process. You lose track of where you are, and when you try to get back on track, you might not be able to find your place in the sequence. The second attentional mechanism is explicit monitoring. This is almost the opposite of distraction, but it's equally disruptive. This is when you become overly focused on processes that are normally automatic. In riding, you have motor skills that, through practice, have become automatic. Your aids, your position, the feel of the gaits, these things don't require conscious attention when they're well practiced. But under pressure, especially if you're being watched or judged, you can start explicitly monitoring and consciously controlling these automatic processes. This explicit monitoring disrupts the smooth execution of automatic skills. It's like thinking about each step while you're walking downstairs. Suddenly, you're more likely to trip. In dressage, if you start consciously thinking about every detail of your position or your aids instead of letting them operate automatically, your riding becomes less fluid and more error prone. And that explicit monitoring consumes attentional resources that should be available for tracking your test sequence. Different types of pressure can trigger these different mechanisms. Research shows that outcome based pressure, like knowing there's a lot riding on this test or that you need a certain score, tends to increase worry and distraction. Performance based pressure, like being watched and evaluated, tends to increase explicit monitoring. In a dressage test, you're experiencing both simultaneously. You care about your score, and you're literally being watched and evaluated by a judge and probably by other riders and spectators. So you're vulnerable to both mechanisms at once. Let me talk about individual differences because not everyone is equally vulnerable to these memory lapses under pressure. Research shows that people with high trait anxiety, meaning they generally tend to experience anxiety across situations, are significantly more likely to experience memory problems under pressure. They already have reduced working memory capacity compared to low anxiety individuals, and that deficit gets worse under stress. They also have poorer attentional control, meaning they're more distractible and have harder time filtering out irrelevant information. There's also something called self consciousness, which is how much you tend to focus on yourself and how you're being perceived by others. People high in self consciousness are more vulnerable to performance anxiety in situations where they're being evaluated. The very nature of a dressage test, where a judge is literally sitting there writing down their evaluation of everything you do, is designed to trigger self consciousness. If you're someone who already tends to be very aware of how others perceive you, the judging situation is going to create particularly high anxiety, which then disrupts your memory and performance. Now, I want to talk about a really important nuance in how stress affects memory for familiar routines and sequences. Because you might be thinking, but I know this test. I've ridden it so many times at home, it should be automatic. And that's where the research gets interesting. Stress actually does tend to preserve performance on well practiced automatic routines, but it does so by making your memory more rigid and less flexible. What this means is that if you've always practiced your test the exact same way, in the same arena with the same approach, stress will tend to preserve that exact sequence. But if anything is different in the show environment, if the arena is bigger or smaller, if there are letters in different positions, if your horse is moving differently than at home, your ability to adapt and adjust is compromised. You might know the movements, but you can't flexibly retrieve them when the context is different from your practice. Additionally, even though the movement sequence might be practiced, the specific context of riding in front of a judge at a show is not something you can practice in exactly the same way at home. Your memory for sequences is somewhat context dependent. The context cues help trigger the next item in the sequence. When you practice at home, you're building associations with those practice conditions. At the show, the context is different, so those retrieval cues don't work as well. Let's shift to talking about what actually works to prevent these memory failures, because understanding why it happens is interesting, but what writers really need are practical, evidence based strategies to protect their memory under pressure. And fortunately, the research gives us some very clear answers about what works. The single most effective strategy for protecting memory under pressure is something called retrieval practice, also known as active recall or practice testing. This means that instead of just practicing writing through your test repeatedly, you practice retrieving the test sequence from memory without external cues. The way most writers practice is they ride through the test with the test sheet nearby, maybe memorized it by reading it repeatedly, and they ride through it. But that's not retrieval practice. Retrieval practice would be close the test sheet, stand in the middle of your arena, or sit in your living room and mentally walk through the entire test from memory. When you get stuck, note where you got stuck, then check the test, then start over and try to retrieve it again. Do this repeatedly until you can mentally walk through the entire test without any external cues. Then, ride through it without looking at the test sheet, and if you forget, stop, retrieve it from memory, and continue. Research shows that retrieval practice creates much stronger, more stress resistant memory traces than simply studying or repeatedly writing through something. The act of retrieval itself, especially when it's effortful, strengthens the memory pathway in a way that passive review doesn't. And critically, memories formed through retrieval practice are more robust under stress than memories formed through simple repetition. Studies have actually tested this directly with stress induction. They have people learn material either through restudying or through retrieval practice. Then they induce stress before testing, and they consistently find that retrieval practice protects memory against stress related impairment, while restudying doesn't. If you've learned your test primarily by writing through it repeatedly rather than practicing retrieval, your memory for that sequence is vulnerable to stress related disruption. If you've learned it through repeated retrieval practice, it's much more protected. The second highly effective strategy is spaced repetition. This means spreading your practice of retrieving the test over multiple sessions across days or weeks, rather than cramming it all into one or two intensive sessions right before the show. Research shows that spaced learning creates stronger, more durable memory traces than massed practice. When you space out your retrieval practice, you're forcing your brain to work harder to retrieve the information each time because it's had time to start fading. That effortful retrieval strengthens the memory. The optimal spacing depends on how far in advance you're starting, but the general principle is that you want gradually increasing intervals. Practice retrieving the test today, practice again tomorrow. Then wait 2 days and practice again. Then wait 3 or 4 days. Each time you successfully retrieve it after a longer interval, you're strengthening the memory and making it more resistant to forgetting under stress. Combining retrieval practice with spaced repetition is especially powerful. Don't just ride through your test 5 times in one day. Instead, practice retrieving it from memory once a day for 2 weeks leading up to the show, with some longer gaps in the middle. This creates much more robust memory than intensive practice the week before. Now let's talk about mental practice, because this comes up a lot in equestrian contexts, and the research does support it, but with some important nuances. Mental practice means vividly imagining yourself performing the test, not just thinking about the movements abstractly, but really visualizing riding through it, imagining what it feels like, what you see from your horse's back, the rhythm of the gaits, the cues you give, the feeling of the transitions. Research shows that mental practice does enhance motor learning and can improve performance. It's not as effective as actual physical practice, but it's much better than no practice, and it can be especially useful when you can't physically practice. For dressage riders, mental practice has the advantage that you can do it anywhere. You don't need your horse, you don't need an arena, and you can practice the show environment context. Here's what makes mental practice work. You want it to be as vivid and detailed as possible, and you want to practice it from an internal perspective, meaning you're imagining what you see and feel from your own eyes, not watching yourself from outside. You want to include all the sensory details you can: the sound of your horse's hooves, the feel of their back underneath you, the visual markers as you pass them, the feeling in your body as you prepare for each movement. And critically, you want to mentally practice not just the test itself, but the test in the show environment. Imagine entering the show arena, saluting the judge, dealing with your horse feeling a little tense or distracted, managing your own nerves, and successfully riding through the test while handling those challenges. This mental practice in the stressful context helps create memory traces that are associated with that context, making them more accessible when you're actually in it. There's also research supporting the value of practicing retrieval under simulated pressure conditions. This doesn't mean you need to recreate full show conditions at home, though that can be valuable, but even small additions of pressure during practice can help. Have someone watch and evaluate you. Ride the test with a specific score goal in mind. Add a time pressure. Practice when you're already tired or stressed from other things. Set up consequences for mistakes during practice. What this does is start to train your retrieval process to work under pressure rather than only in low pressure practice conditions. Research shows that memory performance is somewhat specific to the arousal state in which it was formed. If you only practice retrieving your test when you're calm and relaxed, that memory is optimized for calm, relaxed retrieval. If you also practice retrieving it when you're somewhat stressed or aroused, you're building memory traces that are accessible in that state. Let me talk about pre-performance strategies, things you can do right before and during your test to support your memory. One of the most researched approaches is controlled breathing and brief mindfulness techniques. Research shows that brief mindfulness practice, even just a few minutes of focused breathing before performance, can improve attentional control and reduce anxiety enough to protect working memory and performance. The mechanism here is that mindfulness training helps you notice when your attention has drifted to worries or distractions and gives you the skill to redirect it back to task relevant information. During your test, if you notice your mind starting to worry about making mistakes or wondering what the judge is thinking, those mindfulness skills let you catch that distraction and redirect attention back to where you are in the test and what movement comes next. Controlled breathing, specifically, like taking several slow, deep breaths before entering the ring, can help regulate your nervous system and reduce the acute stress response. You're not going to eliminate nerves entirely, and you shouldn't try to because some arousal actually helps performance, but you can moderate the stress response enough that it doesn't completely hijack your cognitive resources. Another pre performance strategy is mental rehearsal right before you ride. In the minutes before entering the ring, mentally walk through your test one more time. This serves as a final retrieval practice that primes your memory, and it gives you a chance to identify any spots where your memory feels shaky so you can reinforce them before you begin. Some writers find it helpful to have a physical or verbal cue they associate with test mode. Maybe it's a specific phrase you say to yourself, or a physical gesture like adjusting your gloves in a particular way. You practice this cue during your retrieval practice sessions at home, and then you use it before and during your test at the show. This creates an additional retrieval cue that can help trigger the memorized sequence. During the test itself, one strategy that research supports is using environmental cues systematically. Your arena letters are already there as cues, but you can create additional ones. Maybe you associate each movement not just with a letter, but with a visual landmark, the judge's booth, a particular tree, the gate. The more distinct retrieval cues you have associated with each part of the sequence, the easier it is to remember what comes next, even under pressure. You can also practice internal self talk strategies that research shows help with performance under pressure. Instead of letting your internal dialogue run wild with worry, you deliberately use specific types of self talk. Mastery self talk focuses on the process and learning. I've practiced this thoroughly. I know this test. Trust my preparation. Instructional self talk gives yourself quiet reminders of key technical points: soft hands, steady leg. Research shows that mastery oriented self talk helps maintain motivation and reduces anxiety, while instructional self talk keeps attention focused on task relevant information rather than allowing distraction. You don't want constant internal chatter, that would be distracting, but having a few prepared phrases that you can use strategically when you notice anxiety rising or attention wandering can help you stay on track. Let me address something that causes a lot of anxiety, which is the fear of forgetting itself. There's research showing that anxiety about memory failure actually makes memory failure more likely. This creates a vicious cycle. You're worried about forgetting your test. That worry consumes working memory resources and increases attentional distraction, which makes you more likely to forget, which confirms your fear and makes you more anxious next time. Breaking this cycle requires accepting that memory lapses can happen and having a plan for managing them without catastrophe. Research shows that people who view occasional failures as normal and manageable handle pressure better than people who view any failure as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. If you can shift from forgetting my test would be a disaster that proves I'm not good enough to forgetting my test would be frustrating, but it happens sometimes and doesn't define me as a writer, you reduce the stakes psychologically, which reduces anxiety, which actually makes memory failure less likely. Practically, this means having a strategy for what you do if you do forget mid test. Most writers know they can circle to buy time, or in some circumstances, can salute and ask the judge for help. But just knowing you have options if you forget reduces the panic response to a memory lapse, which makes it less likely to cascade into complete shutdown. The bell of doom is not the end of the world, even though it feels catastrophic in the moment. There's also value in understanding what doesn't work well for preventing memory failures under pressure. A lot of writers think that if they just practice the test more times, ride through it more repetitions, that will make it stick. But research shows that simple repetition without active retrieval practice is not very effective for creating stress resistant memories. You can ride through a test 50 times and still forget it under pressure if you haven't practiced retrieving it from memory. Similarly, passive studying of the test, reading through the test sheet multiple times, watching videos of other people writing the test, these are not very effective preparation methods for memory under pressure. They create familiarity, you recognize the test when you see it, but they don't build strong retrieval pathways. Recognition and recall are different cognitive processes, and you need recall for writing the test from memory. Trying to rely on willpower or just telling yourself to focus harder also doesn't work well. When anxiety and stress are disrupting your working memory and attention, conscious effort and willpower are not sufficient to overcome those disruptions. You need strategies that work with your brain's natural processes rather than trying to force your way through the interference. Some writers try to manage anxiety by avoiding thinking about the test until they absolutely have to, by distracting themselves before their ride. While distraction can temporarily reduce anxiety, it doesn't prepare your memory system for retrieval under pressure. You're better off using that pre ride time for mental rehearsal and controlled breathing, which both reduce anxiety and prime your memory. Let me talk about the role of experience and repeated exposure to show environments. Research shows that repeated exposure to high pressure performance situations does eventually reduce the stress response and protect memory. Early in your showing career, the show environment triggers a very strong stress response because it's novel and your brain perceives it as threatening. With repeated exposure, your brain learns that this situation isn't actually dangerous and the stress response moderates. This means that memory lapses under pressure are often more frequent when you're less experienced with shows. As you show more, even if you continue to feel some nerves, the acute stress response diminishes and memory becomes more robust. This doesn't mean you should just accept memory failures early in your showing career and wait for experience to fix it. The strategies we've discussed work at all experience levels. But it does mean that it's normal for memory under pressure to improve as you gain experience, and early struggles don't predict future inability. There's also research on trait anxiety and how it relates to performance anxiety in specific domains. Some people have generally high anxiety across many situations, but others develop specific anxiety about particular performance contexts. You might be generally calm but have specific anxiety about dressage tests. This domain specific anxiety responds to the same strategies we've discussed, but it also responds to gradual exposure and building confidence through successful experiences. If you've had memory failures at shows before, that can create domain specific anxiety about future shows. You're now worried not just about the show in general, but specifically about forgetting your test again. Addressing this requires both cognitive strategies, like challenging catastrophic thoughts about forgetting and building more realistic expectations, and behavioral strategies like making sure your next show experiences are well prepared with the retrieval practice and other techniques we've discussed, so you can have success experiences that rebuild confidence. Let me talk about working memory training as a more involved intervention. There's research showing that certain types of cognitive training can improve working memory capacity and attentional control, which then reduces anxiety's impact on performance. Things like effective working memory training, which uses emotionally relevant material, or adaptive dual end back training, which systematically increases difficulty, have been shown to improve working memory and reduce test anxiety. For writers struggling with persistent memory failures under pressure, despite using other strategies, targeted working memory training might be worth exploring. This isn't something you do the week before a show. It's more of a longer term intervention, but research does support that it can improve the underlying cognitive capacities that support memory under pressure. Similarly, mindfulness training as a more extensive practice, not just brief pre performance breathing, but regular mindfulness meditation over weeks or months, has been shown to improve attentional control, reduce anxiety, and protect working memory under stress. High stress populations like military personnel and first responders have been shown to benefit from mindfulness training in terms of cognitive resilience under pressure. While the demands of a dressage test obviously aren't the same as military operations, the underlying cognitive mechanisms are similar, and the training principles apply. As we start wrapping up, I want to emphasize a few key takeaways that I hope will change how you think about and prepare for memory under pressure. First, forgetting your test at a show is not evidence that you didn't practice enough or that there's something wrong with your memory. It's a predictable response to stress and anxiety disrupting specific cognitive processes that you can learn to protect with the right preparation. Second, the single most important change you can make in your preparation is to shift from repetition based practice to retrieval based practice. Stop just riding through your test repeatedly and start actively practicing retrieving the sequence from memory. Make that retrieval effortful. Do it under various conditions. Space it out over time. This creates memories that are fundamentally more resistant to stress related disruption. Third, managing anxiety isn't about eliminating nerves entirely. Some arousal and activation helps performance. It's about preventing anxiety from becoming so high that it consumes all your working memory resources and completely derails your attentional control. Strategies like controlled breathing, mindfulness techniques, realistic self talk, and having a plan for managing mistakes all help keep anxiety at manageable levels. Fourth, if you're someone who's particularly prone to anxiety or who has experienced memory failures at shows before, that doesn't mean you're doomed to keep experiencing them. The strategies we've discussed work, and they work even for people with high trait anxiety or specific performance anxiety. It might take more deliberate application of multiple strategies, but the research is clear that memory under pressure can be improved. Fifth, experience helps. If you're early in your showing career and struggling with memory under pressure, know that this often improves naturally with more exposure to show environments as your brain learns that the situation isn't as threatening as it initially feels. But don't just wait for experience to solve it. Active use of evidence based strategies will accelerate the improvement and prevent you from building up negative associations with showing. And finally, if you do forget your test in the show ring despite your best preparation, remember that it's not a catastrophe. It's frustrating, it's disappointing, but it doesn't define you as a writer or mean you can't be successful at showing. Every experienced writer has stories of memory failures, missed tests, mistakes under pressure. What separates people who ultimately succeed from people who give up is not whether they make mistakes, but whether they learn from them and keep going. If you're currently struggling with test anxiety or memory lapses at shows, I hope this episode has given you both an understanding of what's happening and concrete strategies you can start using immediately. Practice retrieval, not just repetition. Space your practice over time. Use mental rehearsal, especially in simulated pressure conditions. Develop pre performance routines that include breathing and final mental rehearsal. Have a plan for managing mistakes. Consider whether working memory training or mindfulness practice might help. The research tells us that memory under pressure is improvable, that specific strategies work reliably across populations and contexts, and that the psychological processes involved are understandable and manageable. Your brain isn't betraying you randomly, it's following predictable patterns in response to stress and anxiety. And once you understand those patterns, you can work with them rather than against them. That's what we've got for today's episode of Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and I'll be back next week with another deep dive into the psychology and science of equestrian performance. Until then, practice your retrieval, trust your preparation, and remember that even when your brain feels like it's working against you, you have strategies that can help you stay on track. Keep taking those strides toward your solutions.